Hey everybody, back with some more Kings and Heroes on the channel today, and I wanted to make this video in response to a comment I got on one of my live stream videos. This was from Enlightened Dumbass, who asked, "What if I don't always want to group? How is solo gameplay?" Now, I responded to this comment directly in the comment section, as I often do, but it made me realize that it might be a good idea to make a video about what the solo experience in Kings and Heroes is actually like. So what I've decided to do here is to make a brand new champion character that I'm going to use to demonstrate some of the do's and don'ts of solo play in this game. While I firmly believe it's possible to solo any of the classes on the easy difficulty in any of the dungeons, given some patience and a bit of careful consideration in one's gameplay, I will admit that I picked the champion in this case because I felt it would probably be a little bit easier a class to solo given its propensity toward tanking. I also intentionally chose the orc as my race because of the strength and constitution benefits that it has. Again, just to make things a little easier on myself. But what I think you'll see here by the end of the video is that with a bit of forethought and a bit of technique, you can work around any of the deficiencies that any of the particular races or classes might have in a solo situation. And it's really just a question of being careful and thoughtful about the way you play the game if you want to experience success soloing in it. So without further ado, let's jump into an easy, small crypt dungeon and see how things go. In most cases, in these introductory dungeons, you'll have 3 different paths that you can take. In my experience, it doesn't much matter which way you go at first, although I have found that going to the right tends to lead to some pretty easy initial loot pickups. The next thing you're going to want to do is take a look at your skills and abilities for your particular class. In particular, you're going to want to emphasize anything that allows you to block, evade, or otherwise neutralize any of the initial enemy attacks. One thing about this game, especially in these early levels, is that there are many invisible enemies that can ambush you unexpectedly, and many enemies that can stun or put you to sleep. One thing that's important to recognize right away when playing this game solo is that you want to do to the enemies the things that you most hate them doing to you. So if, for example, you really don't like being stunned, that's something you should think about trying to do to the enemies as often as possible, because in the same way that stuns and sleeps make you vulnerable to them, they make them vulnerable to you. Once you've had a chance to familiarize yourself with your character's abilities, you're going to want to set off in a particular direction. Keep in mind that the doors that separate sections of the crypts can be used to block enemies or allow you to retreat temporarily if you do get into trouble. I'm not going to really do any of that in this particular footage, but I just wanted to throw it out there in case you find yourself really struggling and need to use the environment to your advantage. Now you'll notice here in this initial engagement I use a charge, and the charge in the case of the champion is actually kind of a blessing and a curse when you're first starting out in the game. The good thing about the charge is that it taunts and otherwise engages a particular enemy very quickly and allows you to travel great distances in a single motion. The bad thing about that when you're playing solo is that it tends to expose you to any hidden enemies you may charge past that can then hit you from behind, and also tends to put you into a position where you can easily be surrounded by enemies that you may not have seen until you charged into the new area. As a result, I'd highly recommend being very cautious when using that ability, or the mage's teleport ability in a solo context. The other thing I would highly recommend is to periodically take a look at your inventory and be sure that you're always equipping the best equipment available to you at any given time. There's no harm in taking a moment to look through the equipment that you've looted in a given wing before proceeding to the next wing or the next floor of the dungeon. And especially when you're first starting out as a brand new character soloing, every little buff and every little added piece of oomph that you can give to your character is going to make a huge difference, especially when playing solo. So in this first attempt, I make two pretty big mistakes. One of which is that I equip a second weapon into my weapon set, replacing my shield and removing my ability to stun enemies and block incoming attacks. While certain classes such as the rogue are pretty naturally good at dual-wielding weapons, this isn't really the champion's forte, and as you can see here, I'm very quickly overwhelmed and killed by these enemies as a result. In my second attempt, I didn't learn too much from my mistakes, and am pretty quickly killed in the first wing after charging in to a group of enemies that I didn't see until after making the charge. Now the good news is, in every attempt you gain a little bit more loot, even if you only kill a handful of enemies. So don't get discouraged if you find yourself wiping very early on in these first few attempts, because every little bit you do to make your character better and learn the best ways to play them is going to make you that much better in subsequent attempts. For my third attempt, I've switched back to the sword and shield. This allows me to stun enemies, which I quickly realize is a major advantage to this particular class. Also, don't forget to check any breakable objects such as these jars for potential loot. Some of the best loot items I've gotten in these initial runs actually came from them, even though they don't happen very often. Now, this run goes pretty well for the most part until I get to this room at the end of the wing. And the big mistake I make here is charging headlong into the room without having a good sense of just how many enemies are in it. A much better technique here would have been to pull one or more of them around the corner and try to deal with them one at a time. But die and learn. Attempt number 4 was going along swimmingly until I found myself confronted with a skeleton summoning mage. Now, having seen this enemy before, I knew I had to take him out before he summoned more skeletons to attack me. The mistake I made here was not immediately checking my surroundings after charging and killing the caster, because I ended up getting peppered to death by these archers before I even realized what was going on. So, pro tip, always be aware of your surroundings and don't revel in your victory until you confirm that the new area you've entered is actually secure. Finally, don't be afraid to experiment with new weapons and tactics. One of the coolest things about Kings and Heroes is the fact that it doesn't lock you into a particular archetype when it comes to the gear and equipment that you use. A champion, who's typically thought of as a melee, tanky type class, is perfectly capable of picking up and using a bow fairly effectively. And when approaching various situations in the dungeons, it can be to your advantage to try to engage targets at range to better determine the precise nature of an environment before entering into it. The bottom line for me is that soloing is definitely possible. It may take more or less effort depending on the class and race and stats and gear that you have, but depending on what sort of experience you're looking to have with the game, a bit of a challenge might be a good thing. In any case, I hope this video has helped you to see some of the possible different scenarios and techniques you can employ when attempting these dungeons by yourself. As always, if you have enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more videos from me in the future, be sure to hit subscribe, and I will see you next time.